Alright, everyone. Today I have another tier list for you guys, and I feel like this is an interesting one. We're talking about console add-ons. Now, if you don't know what an add-on is, it's essentially a piece of hardware that either plugs into the system or otherwise connects to a console and provides increased functionality that wasn't previously in that console. So think of a peripheral or attachment that adds a completely different purpose that wasn't there before, and in a lot of cases, an entirely new library of games that you cannot play without the peripheral. So, without further ado, let's get started with the F tier. I mean, I don't need to explain what a tier list is. People have been doing tier list videos for many, many, many years, myself included. So let's just get started with the F tier, which there are a lot of because add-ons are not something that's had a good reputation over the past 30, 40 plus years since they've been in existence because they've mostly been flops and underwhelming. So I will say, as a spoiler alert, the vast majority of the add-ons featured in this tier list are F through C. Very few in B, like a very small amount in A, and only one in the S tier. So let's get started with the first one, which would be the HD DVD driver add-on for the Xbox 360. Do I need to explain why this needs to be in the F tier? Well, I guess I will anyway. The HD DVD was supposed to be the next evolution of DVD format, where it had a lot of advancements. You can actually properly view you could view films in HD resolution because DVDs were only limited to 480p, I believe. So the quality was a lot higher. The pictures, you can actually hold more data on the disc, etc., etc. Well, as you know, the HD DVDs were one of the biggest failures in the 2000s because Blu-ray was another competing format that just completely overtook HD DVD and made it obsolete within about a year or so. The reason why Microsoft partnered with Toshiba, who was the main creator of the HD DVD format, instead of Blu-ray, well, it's because Blu-ray was owned and created by Sony. And there's no way that Microsoft was going to partner with Sony in any way when they were simultaneously competing against them with their home console. So the HD DVD actually launched for $200, and this was back in 2008. So in today's money, that would be $300 for something that was useless pretty quickly, because even by 2008, the HD DVD was essentially dead. And they sold 300,000 units. 300,000 poor souls actually bought the damn thing, which is very sad. But yeah, moving on to the PlayStation VR 2. Now, this is a recent one. $549. That's what the PSVR 2 launched at. It, of course, was the successor to the original PlayStation VR that came out a few years before on PlayStation 4. This, of course, was utilizing the increased power and performance of the PlayStation 5, so it was a PS5 add-on. The problem is not necessarily the hardware itself or the technology behind it, and that's actually a common theme around all of these add-on devices. The actual technology and hardware surrounding these devices are actually really cool for the most part. But the problem is most of them ended up huge commercial failures because the way that they were implemented were not very good. And if you actually ended up buying one of them, you ended up with buyer's remorse 95% of the time. And anyone who bought a PSVR 2 is definitely feeling that right now. because within less than a year of the device's release in 2023, by 2024, was pretty much completely discontinued and no longer being supported. You don't hear about any PSVR 2 games being released anymore because of how low the sales were, and a huge reason for the sales being as low as they were was the lack of backwards compatibility. So if you had an original PSVR and you were a fan of that device, which many people were, at a time, it was the most successful VR system in the entire VR market. So instead of building off that momentum, kind of like Sony did with the PS5 and PS4, like if you're comparing the consoles, where you had that backwards compatible support, you can play your PS4 library on PS5, you couldn't play your PSVR 1 library on PSVR 2. And that was a huge mistake, and I think that was the number one reason why it failed, alongside the price point, because you're paying a premium, a lot more than you did for the original system, but there's no games, and you can't even, like, at least enjoy the games you already have, like, maybe have, like, an enhanced version of those games, because the PSVR 1 was significantly underpowered due to the device that it was running on. So, PSVR 2 is definitely one of the worst add-ons of all time. Then we're going to talk about the Jaguar CD. I don't really think I need to explain myself here. The Jaguar itself was one of the biggest failures in the home console market and ultimately led to Atari withdrawing from the home console market and becoming essentially irrelevant after the mid-90s. No one really talks about them anymore. They still exist in some form, but they have lost any significance in the industry. And it started with the Jaguar. Now, you already have a console that has limited support, very few compelling games, very expensive to own. It was a very expensive console that was significantly underpowered, considering that it launched in '94, not long before the PS1, which was way more powerful than the Jaguar, which was essentially a 32-bit console compared to the 16-bit Super Nintendo. So it was a lot more powerful than the popular consoles at the time. Problem was, PS1 and eventually N64, which came into the market just a year or two later, completely destroyed the Jaguar in terms of game performance, because they used 64-bit processors and were capable of full 3D gaming, which the Jaguar was not. So, the Jaguar CD was an add-on to an already terrible system and platform. Like, why did they feel the need to do this? I remember an Angry Video Game Nerd years ago made a whole special about console add-ons, and the Jaguar CD was featured prominently, and he talked about how it looked just like a toilet, and I can definitely, still to this day, I could see that. It looks just like a toilet that you put on top of your console, and I think that's very fitting. I think it had a very small handful of games that were actually released on the Jaguar CD. 11 games total. 11 games for the Jaguar CD. And at the time, launched, so in 1994, it was $150, which adjusted for inflation is $300 in today's money, down the fucking drain. And they obviously didn't sell a lot of units because no one bought the actual console that it was built on to begin with. So, Jaguar CD is definitely fitting and definitely belongs on this list. I would say, like, if we did, like, an actual worst to best ranking, Jaguar CD would be the worst out of all of these, I would say. And, I mean, but the 32X gives it a run for its money, because the 32X was an add-on for the Sega Genesis that was released at the same day, the same time, same day, as the Sega Saturn in Japan. And you could see how that was a problem, because this was an add-on for the Genesis, but it was supposed to be an add-on that added new power and capabilities to the system, making it 32-bit capable instead of just 16-bit, almost doubling the processing power. and capabilities of the original Genesis, and had its own library of games that you can only play on the 32X, like Knuckles Chaotix, and a very few other ones. Like, the Sega CD was another add-on that they came out with in the early 90s, but it was much earlier in the Genesis life cycle, not at the tail end like the 32X was. And the fact that you had Sega of America really pushing the 32X, saying we can get a few more years out of the Genesis, and this is the future of Sega, while Sega of Japan, the main branch of Sega, saying no, we're doing the Sega Saturn is the future, which is more of a 3D capable console like the N64 and PS1, which even doubling the power with the 32X, the Genesis could not do. Yeah, this was pretty much, people talk about the Saturn, people talk about the Dreamcast, and, so many different things that led to Sega's demise as a first-party console manufacturer. It was really the 32X that did them in, because it damaged Sega's reputation so much beyond repair that it led to the Saturn and Dreamcast not doing as well as they otherwise could have and should have. And just so much money down the drain in terms of R&D and development and everything else. The 32X has got to be one of the, not just add-ons, but one of the worst things to ever happen. Like, one of the biggest failures in the video game industry by far. And it's probably the most profound. It's definitely the most significant in terms of all of the F-tier add-ons, because we're not just talking about quality, we're also talking about the impact that it had on the company. And while the HD DVD add-on didn't really hurt the Xbox 360, I mean, towards the end, them only having standard DVD as their format made it a lot less convenient to own an Xbox 360, because instead of like one disc or maybe 2 discs on the PS3, you had 5 on the Xbox 360. Remember Wolfenstein on the 360? That was ridiculous. But it didn't, like, hurt them fundamentally. Like, this didn't destroy Microsoft and their standing in the home console market. But the Xbox One Kinect certainly did. And I think was one of the 2 main contributing factors to Microsoft's decline in the home console market, and Sony able to enjoy a monopoly, essentially, in the home console market like they do today. So, I guess it's, when it comes to the Kinect, it's hard to really classify it, because technically it's an add-on, because eventually, a couple years into the console's life cycle, it was no longer required to turn the console on for the console to work and for you to own it. But early on, the Kinect was part of the Xbox One, and there was no separation between the console and the Kinect. Always on, always watching. Anyone who was around back in 2013 will remember the controversy and discourse surrounding the Xbox One Kinect. And on another level, because of the Kinect being forced bundled with the Xbox One, it was $100 more expensive compared to the PlayStation 4. And they were riding on Xbox 360 success, just like Sony was riding on PS2 success with the PS3, so they got very overconfident and full of themselves and thought the consumer was going to buy whatever shit that was thrown at them. But it didn't work. It was one of the main reasons, aside from the always online DRM controversy, with where they said you always had an online check-in and the discs didn't work and all that stuff that was going on, their whole E3 2013 presentation. The Kinect was the other main factor that led to the Xbox One's relative failure compared to the PlayStation 4. Especially if you compare that to the PlayStation 3 and 360, where Microsoft was essentially dominating the entire industry during the mid to late 2000s. But just by the early 2010s, they were a shell of their former selves. And the Kinect is a huge part of that. And just looking at game library alone, no one can name me a game on the Xbox One Kinect, like a game that actually utilized the technology, that were actually compelling titles, that were worthy, like that made the whole technology and the experience worth it, and worth the extra $100. The whole selling point of the Kinect was Xbox on, Xbox off. Remember the Aaron Paul commercial back in the day, where the commercial would air and it would actually turn people's consoles on and off? And it was really big because, like, the whole thing with the Xbox One was being able to connect your satellite box or your cable box to the console to make for a more seamless cable console experience, to make it an all-in-one device. Get it? Xbox One. That's why it was called that. That whole thing didn't really resonate with the consumer because it doesn't really... who cares? Like, you know? It's not really a defining feature that's going to make people want to buy it. Like the DVD player for the PS2, for example, right? So, it's like, this was a complete waste of time, waste of money. And of course, we're going to talk about the 360 Kinect pretty soon. But the Xbox One Kinect is just on a whole nother level in terms of failure and damage to the Xbox brand. And there's no doubt about that. So the last one that we have in the F tier, it was also like a really cool concept, but it was a significant commercial failure and ultimately didn't really do what it was set out to do. So this is the IntelliVoice. Now, the IntelliVoice was an add-on for the Intellivision console, which, if you're not familiar with, was the main competitor to the Atari 2600 in the late 70s, early 80s. So we're going way, 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 way back. We're talking like 45 years ago. I think it was 1983 when the IntelliVoice came out, and of course that was around the time of the industry crash, so yeah, that's not good. So obviously this thing was going to fail no matter what. But it was actually a pretty novel concept. So if you guys remember the sound design and just overall game design back in the early 80s, even up until the mid-90s, you had very limited options when it came to sound design. You had 8-bit chiptune sounds or even 16-bit sound, which was a lot better in comparison, but still very limited. We didn't really get to experience full sound design and that being, you know, fully realized until probably the 5th generation, where the consoles were a lot more capable of delivering actual dialogue in-game and characters talking and voice acting and, you know, all that kind of stuff. Well, the IntelliVoice was the first device that tried to remedy that and kind of add to the sound design of many titles. So how it worked is that it was a voice module that actually put actual words out instead of 8-bit sounds. Now, the sound actually came from the add-on itself, not from your TV, not from your console, you know what I mean? It actually came from the IntelliVoice itself, and it actually spoke words to you. I guess the best comparison would be like the DualShock 4 controller, where like words would come out of the speaker of the controller. It worked kind of similar to that, but also very different. It's hard to describe because it was a very unique device, but essentially the whole concept was, let's say you're playing a sports game, right? You actually have like sports commentary being spoken to you in real time. But it wasn't pre-recorded voice lines that were built into the device. It was rather a voice synthesizer that generated speech in real time, in-game. And it plugged into the cartridge slot, and supported games would plug in to the right side over here. But it only supported 5 games in total. 5 games. And it launched for $100 in 1983. And then the video game crash happened very soon after this was released. So, definitely one of the biggest failures on this list by far. So that is the F tier. These are just uniquely terrible devices that had no reason to exist and shouldn't have existed. Now we're going to go to the D tier, which is pretty bad, but not quite as bad as the F tier devices. So, we have a few of these. So first, we have the 64DD. This expanded capability of N64 games using a new disc format that was kind of similar to floppy disks, but it was a unique format that was different than regular floppies, but it didn't use cartridges. And it actually allowed for games to have new features, and like the games were a lot more, because there was more memory in the new disc format compared to the cartridges. That was the thing holding back the N64, was the fact that the cartridge format had a lot less memory compared to the PS1, which used discs, laser discs. So even though the N64 was more powerful on paper, it actually wasn't able to utilize that power because of the limited storage space for the games on that cartridge. So the 64DD was a remedy to this, and it actually added online functionality for the Nintendo 64. This was a Japan exclusive device, so if you lived in North America or Europe and were around back then, you didn't really have access to it. But it had a built-in web browser, you can message people, but it was very limited in what it could do, and was ultimately, the support for it ended not long after it came out. It came out in like 1999, and by 2000, 2001, support for it was already ended as Nintendo was getting ready to launch the GameCube. So very limited shelf life. If you bought one of those things, you definitely felt ripped off. Very limited games actually utilized this technology. And the whole internet thing, I guess, was a cool, novel concept, but really you would rather use a dedicated computing device, which was becoming more and more common in households by the late 90s. So it didn't really have any real purpose to it. Like I said, it was cool, but ultimately no reason for it to exist. So now we have the electronic computer system, which is another add-on for the Intellivision. Now, this was also a commercial failure, by the way. It was supposed to transform the Intellivision into a home computer, so you could see the keyboard and the, like, it's basically a home computer, basically a Coleco, the Commodore 64, rather, sorry. The Commodore 64 was the main home computer at the time that had a lot of commercial success and was very popular, and also had a lot of compelling games to play. So Intellivision thought that they can have their own version of that, and see, it was just honestly a very underwhelming device. As cool as the concept was, to transform a home console into a home computer, we never really seen anything quite like that before. Basically, like I said, it came with a computer, it came with a keyboard, and also significantly expanded the RAM of the device to make it more capable of home computing. So not just gaming, it can store data, you can do some programming on it, and perform very simple tasks. But if you are looking for a computer that can actually be capable of doing things that you need to do, this was not a very good option, because it was very underpowered for a computer, even by 1983 standards. So, while it was cool, And I guess, like, if you didn't have access to a computer and you already owned an Intellivision, buying this was a lot cheaper than buying a separate computer, but at the same time, it was very limited in what it could do as a home computer. And because of that, it was not very good, and certainly belongs on the D tier. So then we're going to talk about the Xbox DVD kit. This was an add-on for the original Xbox that added, or as I would say, a better way of putting it, unlocked DVD functionality to the original Xbox, which the system was already capable of doing, but didn't want to pay licensing fees to have it built into the console. So, in order for the PS2 to be a DVD-capable device, they had to pay licensing fees to the DVD manufacturers. But that was expensive. And while Sony, they were a big console manufacturer and were able to brunt the costs, Microsoft was brand new to the console market and weren't willing to eat those upfront costs. So that's where the Xbox DVD kit came in, which is unique compared to all the other devices we're going to be talking about because, like I said, while these other devices added new functionality, this basically already unlocked existing functionality that was locked behind a paywall. That's basically what this device was for. So it came with a remote control, which is nice because honestly, even to this day, trying to watch movies and use a home console as a multimedia device is very awkward and not very comfortable to use. I'd rather prefer a standard remote. I think the PS2 also sold one, if I recall correctly. A DVD remote. But with that remote was this dongle that basically unlocked the DVD support that the base console was lacking. And it wasn't very expensive. I think it was like 60, 70 bucks back then, whatever it was. But, you know, it didn't really do anything to compete with the PS2, since the PS2 was a lot more convenient because it was already built in. You didn't have to buy a separate thing in order to use the DVD player. And at the time, Sony was already dominating the home console market with the PS2 by the time the original Xbox even launched. So, this device was pretty irrelevant very quickly, and it didn't do anything to make the Xbox more compelling for people to purchase. So, I would say it belongs in the D tier. Not quite F, because it was still useful. Like, if you had an Xbox and you wanted to have that DVD support, like, you had that option, you could do it. So it's great, but if it was just built into the console, it probably would have led to more sales for the OG Xbox. For sure. Now, let's talk about the Famicom modem. So, yeah. This was a device that kind of added, not quite dial-up, but like a version of dial-up in the late 80s. This was 1988. And it added internet functionality to the NES. This was Japan exclusive. And like I said, the capabilities of it were very, very, very limited. Like, for 40 years ago, it was a pretty cool technology, but basically no game supported it. It was supposed to allow you to download and stream games from the connection from the modem, but very few games actually allowed for you to do that. The vast majority of the user base actually used it for horse race betting, because that was one of the features that it had, alongside getting weather forecasts and other really, really small things. And also, most people didn't really have internet capabilities, so it didn't really take off and resonate and was one of the biggest failures of Nintendo. So I'd say it's deserving to be on the list. And now we're actually going to get into handhelds a bit. We're going to talk about the Circle Pad Pro for the 3DS. So as you guys know, with the 3DS, it only came with one, I was going to say analog stick, but it's not really an analog stick. It's like a slider. And was very limited when it came to controlling games, because typically in a video game, you use the left stick to move and the right stick to control the camera. But because you didn't have that second slider on the original 3DS, it was very, very difficult to control your character and to have a comfortable gameplay experience. It was actually one of the biggest problems of the 3DS. I feel like it wasn't that big of a deal with the original DS. It didn't even have a circle pad, it just had the D-pad and ABXY. But the games were a lot more limited, and really just took full advantage of the touch controls, while the 3DS was trying to be a full-on 3D gaming device, and was trying to have compelling games that took advantage of the console's power, like Resident Evil Revelations, which was one of the main games that was borderline unplayable without that second stick, and what this was designed for. So, the Circle Pad Pro, which you can see in the picture, is very, very, very clunky and very bulky. It's almost the entire size of the 3DS itself, which is really bad, right? So that's one thing that's bad enough. But the other thing is that it kind of defeats the entire purpose of a handheld portable device with a very small form factor if you have to carry around another thing that's basically the size of the 3DS itself, right? So that was another reason why it wasn't really that good. And the other thing is that it was very, very, very uncomfortable. I mean, you could see the placement of the right stick, which is to the right of the ABXY. Very weird and very awkward placement, so it wasn't comfortable to use at all. It also added shoulder buttons, too, on the backside. But really, this was something that should have been included in the design of the original handheld, and really held the 3DS back because of only having that one stick. To the point where when they refreshed the 3DS with the new 3DS, they added not a full-on second slider, but they added like a little tiny one on, like, over here, like right next to the X button, that made it a lot easier for camera controls and other functionality. But really, like, looking at the size of this thing, they could have easily just added one right here. Just another stick the size of this right here. I don't know why that was so hard, and why Nintendo was not capable of doing it, but it definitely affected the quality of the 3DS. And the Circle Pad Pro was hardly a solution. So now, moving on to the C tier, we have a few interesting devices here. So first, we have the PlayStation EyeToy, and you also had other versions of it in later PlayStation consoles, like the PlayStation Eye, I think it was called. That was just the PS3 version of the EyeToy. And you had the PlayStation Camera on PlayStation 4. I'm going to kind of lump them all together, because I have the same opinion about all of them, is that they were kind of cool. Like, having a webcam that you can interact with certain games was a cool concept, especially during the PS2 era. It was kind of a precursor to the Wii and the motion controls, although it was very limited in comparison to the Wii remote and sensor and all that. But it was a cool novelty, and there were some games that utilized it and could be fun to play. But ultimately, it's kind of mid, and I wouldn't say was so great that you need to have it. It was just kind of like, whatever. It was just kind of there, right? And I would say the 360 Kinect is deserving of the C tier. It's kind of mid. Like, it's not terrible and wasn't catastrophic to the Xbox brand like the Kinect was for the Xbox One. Although I will say, like, it was around 2010 that Sony was gaining so much momentum with the PS3 and the tide was starting to turn. And a huge part of that was that E3 2010 press conference where Sony just were firing on all cylinders. They had all these cool, amazing exclusives coming to the PS3. And the games. That was the whole point of the E3 presentation that year. While Microsoft's entire focus was the Kinect. You had Kinectimals, and you had all these little Kinect games that they focused way too much on Kinect during the later years of the 360's life cycle. I think that did cause them to lose a lot of momentum and ultimately have a tied console war. While they were originally dominating in the beginning, the Kinect definitely made them lose a lot of goodwill from the consumer. Because at the end of the day, like, this was a device that, again, like, it had some cool... It was a cool concept. Controller-free gaming. It was like considered a huge evolution compared to the Wii Remote. But one problem was a lot of games didn't even work properly with those controls, or lack thereof. It was all motion control based. So think of games like Sonic Free Riders, that was notorious for having very unresponsive controls and being borderline unplayable. And there were so many other ones too, where it was a great idea, but ultimately very frustrating trying to actually have the thing pick up what you were doing, and half the time it wouldn't. So the technology was very underdeveloped and full of problems. But, there were some good moments with it. And it was overall decent and wasn't forced, you weren't forced to have it like the Xbox One. And it wasn't, I don't think it was quite as bad as the ones below it. So I think C tier is very fitting. And now let's talk about the Coleco Atom. It's another similar concept to the ECS that we talked about earlier. It was a add-on to the ColecoVision, which came out later than the Intellivision, and it was supposed to essentially transform the ColecoVision into a home computer. Now, what was unique about this is that they actually did sell the Coleco Atom as a standalone device, like a standalone home computer, but you were actually able to add it on to the ColecoVision and convert it into a home computer, because the actual Coleco Atom, the standalone device, utilizes the ColecoVision console's hardware as its basis. So, while it was actually a really cool concept and definitely a little bit more fleshed out than the ECS for the Intellivision, it was notorious for having a lot of problems with the actual hardware. Like, we're talking about failure rate, quality of the actual computer itself not being very good, and was discontinued pretty quickly, because they had a goal of selling 500,000 units and only ended up selling like 90,000, give or take. So it's definitely was a huge commercial failure, and ultimately didn't really do much for Coleco. And then we have the Wii Motion Plus, which I decided to include because there is a difference between a console add-on and a console accessory. And this would probably lean more towards accessory, but the reason why I decided to include it as an add-on is because there are actually a number of games that you're required to have Wii Motion Plus, and the game did not work without it. And furthermore, there were multiple games that required it, compared to an accessory like the Wii Fit board, which was really only for Wii Fit. Or the microphone that you added on to the controller of the N64, but the only game that really supported it was Hey You Pikachu. While this was a wide array of games, not like a huge amount, not that like if you didn't have it, you couldn't really enjoy the Wii anymore towards the later half, but even games that didn't require it definitely utilized the increased accuracy of the Motion Plus. But it wasn't really a game changer either. Like, you didn't really notice a huge difference. Anyone who actually owned a Wii back then, who had it during the early years and then got the Motion Plus, there really wasn't a huge difference in the experience, the actual Wii control experience. So, I mean, Wii Sports Resort was the main title that required it and utilized it. And if you plugged it in, you can use it for other games that came out before the Motion Plus. But, like I said, it was kind of just meh. There was really no reason for it. It didn't really do anything. It was kind of just there. And then we have the Satellaview, which is a modem add-on for the Super Nintendo. So we talked about the Famicom modem. Now we have Satellaview, which was a more fleshed out version of what we had with the Famicom. So there were a lot more games that supported it, a lot more games that you can download and kind of stream. You know, it was like the 1990s version of streaming, so it mostly came from a satellite connection. But there were actually a number of games that supported it, and you paid a monthly subscription, and it was a more convenient way to play select titles. Obviously, it wasn't ideal, and it was also, you know, it was very bulky, and it was also expensive, and, you know, it wasn't perfect. And it didn't really catch on because it was only released in Japan. But it was really cool. I think it was a much better version of what we had for the NES. And kind of in a lot of ways paved the way for what we eventually get with services like Game Pass and other things that we have now. And then we have the TurboGrafx CD. The TurboGrafx CD is honestly a really cool device. It's a really good add-on and definitely, you know, has a good library of games. The problem is, it's an add-on for a console that was already very expensive. And, you know, the add-on itself was also pretty pricey on its own. And they eventually released a new version of the TurboGrafx 16 that actually had it built into the console. But we're talking about a niche add-on for a console that was already niche. No need to fragment the game's library and the user base that's already small enough. I mean, it was a lot more popular in Japan than it was in the States. But even still, very, very niche in comparison to the Genesis and Super Nintendo, which had a lot more leeway when it came to releasing add-ons because there was a much bigger user base. So, like I said, while it was good, and definitely there were some compelling games that were released for it, but there actually were CD versions of games that were on the cartridge. But if you had the cartridge version, you obviously had to buy the game again, so that was not ideal. But yeah, I don't think you should release an add-on for any console that's already struggling to get sales. And it was really bad for the Jaguar CD because it didn't really have a lot of games, and the Jaguar itself was just a bad console. But, you know, you have a decent add-on for a good console that didn't sell well. I don't think you could put it any higher than C. And then, last on the C tier, we have the expansion pack for the Nintendo 64. I decided to include this because it actually was supported by a lot of games. Even games that didn't require it took advantage of the increased RAM, because that's what it was. It was RAM expansion. So the original N64, the base model, had 4 megabytes of RAM. This essentially doubled the RAM size to 8 megabytes. And it's crazy that we're talking megabytes. I know it was 30 years ago, but damn, like, having 8 gigabytes of RAM, games are unplayable in the modern era of gaming if you only have 8 gigs of RAM. This is 8 megabytes, which is so much smaller. So much smaller. But there were certain games that were outright required, like Donkey Kong 64. But to be fair, if you bought the whole cartridge and everything, the expansion pack was included, and it was for certain other games as well. But yeah, there were certain games that also, like, had content that you can play the game without it, but there were certain things that were locked out that you couldn't experience if you didn't have the expansion pack, like StarCraft 64, for example. But, yeah, I mean, I think it was not necessarily a terrible thing. It wasn't very intrusive, even though, like I said, there were some games that required it, but they did bundle it, similar to the Wii Motion Plus did. Otherwise, if they, like, said, no, like, you need to have this and you need to buy it separately and it cost a good chunk of change, then it would have been ranked probably into D tier. But it did have a use case, and you did notice a difference if you had it put into your N64 with the games that supported it. It definitely was an upgrade, for sure. So now, let's move on to the B tier. We have a lot less, like I said, there's a lot less good compared to bad or average. So we're actually going to start with the PlayStation Move, which is a very interesting entry in the B tier, because if anyone was around back in 2010, where you had the Wii, which was still really popular and revolutionized the gaming industry in many different ways and was dominating the console market. As a result, you had Sony and Microsoft that felt like they needed to respond and answer to that and have their own motion control peripheral. So as you know, with Microsoft, they decided to go with a completely different experience that was controller-free with the Kinect. Sony just decided to basically copy and paste the Wii experience, but put it into the PlayStation 3. And you saw it kind of had like a glowing wand aesthetic to it as well. Now, the problem with the PlayStation Move is that it didn't really have a very long library of games. Like, it didn't have a vast amount of games that were supported by it. So in a lot of ways, I don't think you can consider it a success, right? But it also wasn't a cataclysmic failure, and is actually a device that still has a use case today. It is compatible with the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. You can use the PlayStation Move as the motion control for the PlayStation VR, which is a lot more successful and more significant than the PlayStation Move on its own, or the Kinect, or, you know, anything else. So I'd say it's pretty cool that you can still kind of use it today and get some purpose and use out of it on modern devices. That's one thing. The second thing is that if you compare Sony's approach to Microsoft's approach, Sony had a very minimalist approach when it came to the PlayStation Move. I mean, they marketed it and they pushed it, and it was kind of part of their E3 2010 presentation. But compare that to Microsoft, they went all in on Kinect, while the PlayStation Move was more of a side project. So there were certain existing games that already had like regular controller support. You didn't need the PlayStation Move to buy the games. Games like SOCOM 4, I think Killzone 3. There were a number of first-party titles that utilized it, so it wasn't intrusive. You didn't need to buy the PS Move, but there were certain games that required it. They were kind of like family-oriented games. I think you had like a tennis game, I think, and there were a few other games that used it as well. But it was kind of just there. Like, it didn't really do anything, if that makes sense. Like, it didn't, you weren't gonna really, like, see the games that were released on the PS Move and be like, oh, I need to get one. Not like the Wii. Oh my god, there's so many great games I want to play in the Wii, I need to get a Wii. So the PS Move, like, on its own, during the PS3, was underwhelming. But, you know, I don't think it was bad. And I think it would be a step, I consider it a step above what we have below here, and here, and here, for sure. And I would say the same thing, actually, for the power-based converter for the Sega Genesis, which adds full Master System backwards compatibility for the Sega Genesis. Now, the Master System was a good console with a decent library of games. It was very underwhelming in comparison to the NES because Nintendo pressured a lot of publishers to not release games on the Master System. They said, if you release anything on the Master System, we're going to end our relationship with you. So that scared a lot of publishers away from the Master System. But the Master System did have a good game library overall. And if you're someone that owned one, or even if you didn't, you know, now you had extra functionality for your Sega Genesis, which I thought was really cool. So as you know, like, the cartridge format for the Master System was very different compared to the Genesis, but it just, you know, you put the add-on on top of the Genesis cartridge slot. It had its own power supply also, though, so it was kind of bulky and, you know, not the most convenient and seamless experience, but you would just put the Master System cartridge on top, and it would work. Just like that. Which I thought was really cool. So you can play 2 generations of Sega on one console. At a time where backwards compatibility wasn't really a thing at all, because the Super Nintendo didn't have it with the NES, even though it was basically a sequel to the NES, you know? So, it was nice. It was a nice thing to have. And while, yeah, like, it didn't really... The Master System didn't set the world on fire, so having Master System games wasn't, like, a great thing, but, you know, it was an optional add-on. I think it was good for what it did, allowing for backwards compatibility that wasn't there before. So now we're going to talk about the Famicom Disk, which, even though it came out over a decade before the 64DD, was implemented a lot better, and was actually a more compelling version of that concept. So, yeah, this basically added a floppy disk format to the NES, so it allowed support for games using the new format instead of the traditional cartridge format. But what was cool about the Famicom Disk is that it allowed for the ability to save games. With this new format, you could actually save your game and save your data, which in the late 80s was pretty much unheard of. So it wasn't compatible with existing cartridges, so let's say you had a game that was on the original NES cartridge, but then there was another version of the game that was on the new floppy disk format. You couldn't just plug it into the NES and it would just use the new format. But what you could do is that there were a lot of stores in Japan that it was a kiosk, and for a small fee, you can actually pay to transfer the data from your cartridge into the new disc, which was really cool. So you could theoretically convert your entire NES library to this new format. And what it also allowed for was that it had more storage, so the games could be bigger, more music, more overall content in the game. So it was actually like a very good and useful format that expanded the capabilities of the NES and allowed for an overall better experience. If you're willing to spend the money on the add-on, and you're willing to go through the hassle if you already had a library of cartridge games to convert it to the new format, I'd say overall it was still pretty good. And much, much, much better compared to the N64 DD, which was trying to emulate and do the same thing, but wasn't really able to do it. So, let's move on to the Sega CD, which is another add-on for the Genesis. This is the third Genesis add-on that we covered. And I would say it's probably the best out of all of them, because the Sega CD actually was a really cool piece of technology. It was cashing in on the whole CD craze of the early to mid-90s, because that was a format that was becoming more and more popular. So you can actually play audio CDs on your Genesis, which you couldn't before. So it kind of allowed for a cool multimedia device, because you could put it into, you put whatever disc into the console, and you can play it on your TV, which was pretty cool. But also, there was a pretty decent library of games. Small, obviously very small comparatively, compared to the Genesis, but much bigger than the 32X. And the quality of the games themselves were definitely much better than 32X as well. Sonic CD was a really good game. And it also allowed for FMV, which was a new format that you never really had in a console before. So I would say the Sega CD was actually pretty decent. And it didn't really hurt Sega and their brand, at least not like the 32X did. Definitely not. I think it was overall a pretty decent device that did what it was set out to do, and was overall not bad. So now we're going to talk about the A tier, and this is going to be interesting because I only have 2 devices in this category. I'm sorry, 3. So we have the Super Game Boy, which converted your Game Boy cartridges into, you could play it on your Super Nintendo. So it was a Super Nintendo cartridge, but you put the Game Boy cartridge into the top slot, and now you can play your Game Boy games on your TV. Now, it wasn't a very seamless experience. I mean, it technically allowed for color, because these were black and white gray games. Remember that, that whole aesthetic and experience for the Game Boy. It was very limited. And also, it wasn't backlit, so it was really annoying, like if you were playing at night, like you couldn't really see anything. So, the Super Game Boy was a decent option for enhancing the experience. If there were some games that you really liked on the Game Boy, well, now you can play them on a console. And it had different color palettes that you can choose from. Like, in the settings, you can actually change the colors. All it really did was fill in the color palette. Like, because there were only, like, 4 gray, like, the 4 colors for the original Game Boy, and they were all, like, different variations of gray. All this really did was just fill in the color. It wasn't just, like, a dedicated color version of the game. Although there were certain games, like Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, that did utilize the Super Game Boy and added some color. But most games on the Game Boy didn't really support the Super Game Boy and utilize it to its full potential. So mostly it was just filling in color And, I mean, I guess it looked a little bit better, but, I mean, it wasn't really... I wouldn't say a game changer, but it was really good. Because the Game Boy had a good amount of games, and this was a device that allows you to play more games on a system that already had so many to offer. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it was really good. So, moving on, we talked at the beginning of this video about the PlayStation VR 2. Well, now we're going to talk about the PSVR 1, which was an add-on to the PlayStation 4. Now, VR is It's interesting, because years ago, people were talking about VR being the next big thing, and it was going to take over the industry. To this day, that still hasn't really happened. But VR was something that was gaining a lot of ground and piqued a lot of people's interest in the mid-2010s. So Sony, seeing this, decided to take advantage and release their own VR system that had exclusive games. To this day, there's still games that you can only play on the original PSVR and no other VR platform, and actually had a pretty good library. It was relatively affordable, actually more affordable than most of the VR devices on the market at the time. Devices like the Valve Index and the HTC Vive and the original Oculus. Now, this was a better value proposition, and because the PS4 already had a large install base, you did require the PS4 in order to use it, but since many people already had a PS4, that wasn't anything that really hindered its success and really prevented it from realizing its full potential. The only thing that was holding it back, really, was the limited power of the PlayStation 4. And you definitely saw that with the frame rate being capped at 30, which for a VR game is not good at all. Definitely not good. So the idea of a PSVR 2 was great, because it took a great system and a great platform, a great add-on, and made it more powerful, but the lack of backwards compatibility, I'm still amazed that they decide to go down that route with the PSVR 2. But the PSVR 1 was honestly amazing. And the vast majority of people who had one were glad that they did. And it provided for, like a really good gaming experience. And a decent VR experience. So, I would say the original PSVR is deserving to be on the A tier, for sure. And then, lastly, on the A tier, this is a device that's a lot different than the other ones that we've talked about in this video. But I'd say it's deserving, because you had to have been around back in the late 90s to really appreciate this device and what it was doing. And like, anyone who was a kid that had this had the time of their life. This was way before the era of the selfie, before people, before any young every kid now, and not even now, even 15 years ago, every kid had a camera in their pocket and could just take pictures whenever they want. But this actually allowed your handheld to take pictures. And it came with a printer also, so you can print them out and hang them up on your wall or whatever. Now, it goes without saying, because of the limited processing power of the Game Boy, the actual quality of the pictures themselves, no professional photographer was using the Game Boy camera, I can promise you that. But I, and many other people who grew up with this, had a great experience with it, and got a lot of value out of it. And that's the whole point of an add-on, is to add value and to add functionality, not take away from the experience, like this, and like this, and like this, you know what I mean? So, I would say, because it was simple, but very effective. And I think anyone who was a late 90s kid just has so... Like, if you mention the Game Boy camera, there'll be a smile on their face. And they'll have so many great memories, you know, with their younger sibling, or their cousin, or their friend, just goofing around and taking pictures. You know, because you didn't really have portable devices that could do that. So it was nice. It was a nice thing to have. So I'd say A tier. It might lean more towards accessory than add-on, because like I said, those two things might be a little bit different, but I would say I would just call it an add-on, because it does add functionality to the system. And I don't really think there were a lot of games that utilized the camera at all or anything like that. I'm pretty sure it was just take pictures and print things. That's at least what I used it for and what I knew it as. But yeah, I'd say it belongs in the A tier. So we actually do have one device that's on the S tier. And I was like thinking originally, I'm like, I might not have anything on the S tier because add-ons are notoriously, you know, bad, I guess you could say. Yeah, because like there's so many like bad ones that shouldn't have existed. And even the really good ones, they're great, but are they really S tier level? Like I was thinking about putting PSVR 2 on the S tier. But I struggled with it because of the fact that if you were trying to get into VR, the VR experience was not the best. And it wasn't a long-term, wasn't a viable VR headset. Although it was really good for what it was, it's still, you know, because of how limiting it was, and didn't really meet the standards of a VR experience with how bad the frame rate was and performance, that's what knocked it down a little bit and prevented it from being a full-on S-tier entry. But, I think there is one add-on that stands out above the rest and should be in a tier on its own and should be above all the other ones. So, without further ado, let me reveal the S-tier entry for console add-ons. We have the Game Boy Player for the GameCube. So, this was an add-on that attached to the bottom of the GameCube. And it was a pretty seamless experience. It had a Game Boy cartridge slot on the bottom, like right around here. And you had to insert the Game Boy Player disc into the actual GameCube. But you put it in, and you had access to not only Game Boy, not only Game Boy Color, which the Super Game Boy did not. They had the Super Game Boy 2 years later in Japan that allowed for Game Boy Color. But, you know, the original Super Game Boy didn't let you play Game Boy Color. But this did. So you can play your Pokemon Crystal. You can play a number of other titles on Game Boy Color that you couldn't before with the SNES. And then also you can play Game Boy Advance games. So that 32-bit experience that we kind of skipped over, like in the console market, right? Because we went from 16-bit for the Super Nintendo and Genesis, and then we jumped straight to 64-bit in the 5th generation for the N64, Sega Saturn, and Sony PlayStation. So 32-bit was kind of skipped over. I mean, there were some 32-bit consoles that existed, like the Atari Jaguar, but they were made irrelevant pretty quickly. So we kind of missed out on that 32-bit era of gaming, but the Game Boy Advance allowed for us to experience that. And there were a lot of great 2D platformers and other games that were provided by the GBA that were fantastic. So if you combine the library of all three Game Boy generations into one device that you can play on your TV, and it looks pretty good, and the quality is pretty decent. It hasn't really aged very well on modern TVs. Like, if you're using it on HD TV, it looks very fuzzy, it doesn't look very good. But at its time, You know, we got to talk about the time that it was out and that it was relevant. It was fantastic. And you had a GameCube that already was a good console on its own. Now there were so many other games that you could play. And you didn't need to own a Game Boy Advance to play it. That was the other thing. I think it was actually cheaper than a GBA, if I'm not mistaken. It was. So, great value proposition. Great utility. And I think it has to stand out above all the rest because it adds 3 different platforms to the console's library. And it's just a better experience to play some of these games on your TV. Like, it's really cool. So, yeah, I think it deserves to be on the S tier. I think it stands out a little bit above all the other ones. So, that was my tier list for console add-ons, which I know is a little bit of an obscure topic of discussion. But I thought it would be fun to talk about it and to, you know, have some interesting conversations and delve into some of these weird technologies that we've had in the video game industry over the last 40, 50 years. Because that's how long of a time frame that I went through. Now, looking at it, I'm like, yeah, this is a pretty good list. Now that it's fully realized and I see the full list, you know, right in front of me, I think this is pretty accurate. I don't think there's anything wrong with this tier list at all. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you have any experience with any of these devices, I'm sure there's a lot of you who have experienced this, the Game Boy player, who've experienced the PlayStation VR, and maybe even the Sega CD, if you know, some people who were around back then. And even years later, it's a really popular retro platform that people still want to play games for. All the other ones, though, I mean, Wii Motion Plus, obviously, but, you know, it's a given. I'm sure there's a lot of people who've played a Kinect. But I'm sure, more than half of the ones, probably none of you have even experienced before. Like, I don't think I know anyone in real life who had a 32X. And not even, like, a regular Jaguar, never mind Jaguar CD. Or the IntelliVoice. I actually knew people who had Intellivisions, not the IntelliVoice. Since, like I said, only supported, like, 5 games. HD DVD player. Oh, yeah. But, yeah, I'm interested to see your thoughts in the comments. This is a very long video. So to all those who actually went through the entire thing, I commend you. And, let me know what you want to see for my next tier list. Because I do enjoy doing these. I'm thinking of, like, doing controllers next. I don't think I've done controllers yet. I've done consoles. I've done handhelds. I've done a few things. But I haven't actually done controllers yet. So I think that'll be the next thing on the agenda. And I think that'll be a very interesting discussion. I haven't even thought in my head, like, what would be a good... Like, what would the tier list look like for controllers? Especially going through all 50-plus years of console gaming history. There's also a lot of third-party controllers, but I can't include third-party, because then it would be a ridiculous list, and it would be like a 3-hour affair. No, we would just have to go first-party, I think, for that to work. And I'm just thinking out loud, because I'm already thinking about the next one. So, I'm going to leave you guys, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye.